Hi, today we'll be talking about tanks during World War I by Lila Hodgin, Alex Herexy, Rachel Nowak, and Delaney Partridge.
Okay, so first we will be talking about the evolution of the tank. The first of tanks were developed in response to the trench warfare that developed during World War One. Armored cars were used, but they were failed to function off roads and through barbed wires. So British Colonels Swinton and Hankey thought an armored vehicle would provide protection and the ability to break through the enemy lines. And so in 1915, the first prototype of a tank, which was nicknamed Little Willie, was developed in Great Britain. It weighed measly 14 tons. It moved at a speed of 2 miles per hour, and it got stuck in trenches. And in 1916, a second prototype was built because Little Willie was kind of a failure, so Big Willie was developed, and it was about the same weight, and it seemed to function a lot better. So about 100 tanks were ordered, and they named them Mark the First. And so in 1917, they were used in the Battle of Cambrai with 400 Mark the Fourth. So obviously they are certainly moving along, as this is the fourth of the tanks. And so after that, other countries such as France began developing tanks, um, especially after the success was realized. And they also improved upon the weight of tanks, as 14 tons is a lot, and French tanks that were widely used were 6 tons.
So tanks were used for many things throughout the war. They could resist small arms fire. They were used to travel over difficult land, mostly no man's land in between the two enemy lines. And they were first used in the Battle of the Somme in 1916. They were able to cross trenches, but unfortunately, they could not break through German lines. And the most successful use of tanks was at the Battle of Cambrai, as Lila said. 400 Mark IVs were used, and 8,000 enemy troops and 100 guns were captured. So that was the best success seen with tanks throughout the war. And overall, throughout the war, tanks were mainly used by allies. They were developed by the British, and then, as Lila said, French used them more, so really only used by the Allied forces.
So the impacts of tanks on Allied powers, they gave Britain an element of surprise in the Battle of Somme in 1916 since the tanks were revealed there. So British chose to reveal the tanks in that battle before they had them mass produced, which was kind of it was a controversial move, but because the tanks were like being tested there for the first time, they were shown to have some mechanical issues and they moved really slowly. They only moved at 2 miles per hour, so they weren't that successful. So they didn't have much of a practical impact. In the Battle of Courcelette in 1916, only one out of the six tanks that were used in that battle reached their objective, and they were all put out of use after the battle due to damages. So after a while, the tanks started to get renovated by other countries. So, and because the size and the facts of the tanks were a new invention, um, they were pretty powerful with just intimidating the enemy. They became really important in offensive Allied attacks and when the Allied powers began to coordinate in the later years of the war. So they were coordinated with aircraft, artillery, and more. France took inspiration from Britain's quote unquote secret weapon and developed some smaller tanks that were more effective, and those were put into use in 1918. And tanks weren't used much on the Eastern Front, and they had more of an impact on the trench warfare of the Western Front. And the British tanks that were developed helped start the United States, France, and more countries into producing lighter tanks for the future war weaponry. And overall, tanks helped give the Allied powers a one-up in trench warfare and push them towards coordinated attacks near the end of the war, which ultimately helped them in winning it.
The impacts on the Central Powers. Most of the impact was negative, as much of the Central Powers didn't worry about developing tanks till later in the war. Germany was mainly forced to develop anti-tank weaponry to combat all of the tanks from the Allied powers. Germany did produce some tanks in the later years of the war, but they only produced 20 of these A7V tanks. These tanks were just way too expensive to justify the production of more in this later part of the war. British tanks often broke down across enemy lines. This allowed Germany to take these broken down tanks and repurpose them. So instead of producing their own expensive tanks and worrying about developing good tanks, Many of the times Germans just took these broken down British tanks, repurposed them and fixed them, and then used them in battle against the British. The main battle with the German tanks was the Second Battle of Villers-Bretonneux, which was the first tank-on-tank battle. There were 3 of the German A7Vs, and they were able to temporarily hold off 3 British tanks. They were able to push back the 2 female versions of the tanks, which only had machine guns on them, but the 1 male British tank was able to eventually push back the A7V tanks until it was destroyed by the anti-tank weaponry. Overall, there wasn't much of a significant gain for the Central Powers to the use of tanks, as there wasn't much tank development compared to the Allied powers, which had a lot of tank development.